Hey there, it is Saturday, so it's movie night, and I'm here to present another quarantine quadruple feature for your viewing pleasure. We just finished our 18th week of quarantine. Now, if you watched my week 17 video, it's really long. It's like an hour. It's definitely the most in-depth video that I've done, and it was a lot of work. It took me the entire weekend to get the thing edited together, so I'm going to pull it back a little bit this week. I'm going to hopefully keep this a lot more succinct. If you didn't watch last week's video, go check it out, though. It's really cool. It's on movie music, and I play a lot of really great music, some of my favorite scores. So put that one on the background when you're doing the dishes or something, unless you want to see my sweet dance moves, then just watch it. Now, if you are one of the small handful of people that watches all of these quarantine quadruple feature videos, then you probably remember 10 weeks ago I did for week 8 Kindred Trauma Alien Encounters, alien movies that scared me when I was a kid. And I talked at length about my love for Mars Attacks, specifically the original trading cards. And I even went into detail describing a specific card that was the most controversial card about an alien killing a dog, and it was called Destroying a Dog. I have a really great friend named Courtney who does watch all of these, and literally right before I came over here to film this video, I opened my mail, and in it I had a card from Courtney with the original card from the Mars Attack series, Destroying a Dog, that I talked about in that episode. So he tracked this down, and it's an original, and he mailed it to me, and that was very sweet. Thank you, Courtney. I will cherish this. All right, last week and most weeks, I really try to pick films from a variety of different decades, unless it's we're focusing on the 90s or 80s or something like that. I try to be varied when I'm selecting the films. We're going to really narrow it down this week, and not only are we going to focus on one specific decade, we're going to focus on one specific year. Now, when you look at films from the 90s, there's a lot of really great films to choose from, but most cinephiles are not going to argue that the 90s is the greatest decade for cinema. The 70s really has some of the best films ever made, and there are certainly gems throughout the 90s, but overall, it's not necessarily the strongest decade. Even though the 90s in general aren't necessarily the greatest decade for cinema, I do think 1999 is the greatest year for cinema that we've ever had. And I don't know what it was about 1999. Maybe it was just the fact that we were moving into a new decade. Everyone was going crazy from Y2K. Everyone's trying to get their last great film out before the world ended. I don't know. There was something in the air, though, where so many filmmakers were turning out the best work that they would ever do. So many terrific films. Stanley Kubrick's final film, Eyes Wide Shut. Paul Thomas Anderson's masterpiece, Magnolia. The Talented Mr. Ripley. Three Kings, The Matrix, obviously, Fight Club, The Iron Giant, The Virgin Suicides, The Green Mile, Any Given Sunday, I love. I didn't see it in theaters, but My Voyage to Italy, Scorsese documentary about Italian film, Being John Malkovich, Election, one of my top 5 favorite movies of all time, American Movie, came out in 1999. I mean, it's just an astonishing year for cinema. I could do a night of 1999 for sure, but that's too good of a year to focus down into 4 films. So I had to narrow it down even further. And we are going to be looking tonight specifically on the game-changing horror that came out in 1999. Because not only was it a terrific year for every genre, sci-fi for the Matrix, comedy for Drop Dead Gorgeous, South Park Bigger, Longer, Uncut, dramas for The Insider. There were also some really terrific horror films. And the great things about the horror films that came out in 99 is that they are so varied, so different, and so monumental for different reasons. So we're going to dive into the 4 films that I've selected and why I think each film is so important. Now, 1999 was a very special year for me as a film goer. You know, I was 15 years old. Me and my friend Ryan would go see movies all the time, and so many of the movies that came out in 1999 were films that I saw with him. I also saw a bunch of films with my dad, but that was really the first time that I kind of tasted freedom, going to movies by myself with my friends. And I feel like every time I went to the movies, I was watching what I thought was a masterpiece. Every movie I went to see that year was amazing, and I have so many specific memories. Every movie I went to in '99, I felt like I just kept hitting gold, and I was thinking that every year was going to yield such fantastic films. I just have to go see them. Now, that hasn't been the case as the years and decades have gone on. We have not seen a year like 1999 again. But I still remember as a 15-year-old who's a budding cinephile and watching as much great cinema as he can, to see all of those terrific movies in theaters was really a pivotal experience for my formative film years. I feel like I was really spoiled. Really some of the best theater-going experiences I ever had. Some really stupendous movies came out that year. But we're going to dive into the 4 horror films that I've selected, each one very groundbreaking in its own way. Of course, one of the movies that just owned 1999, the most influential twist-ending film of all time, M. Night Shyamalan's masterpiece, The Sixth Sense, starring a brilliant young Haley Joel Osment and Bruce Willis. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the ending is. If you have somehow managed to never see The Sixth Sense and never have it spoiled for you, you're playing a dangerous game. I mean, I don't think there's a person like that exists, but go see the movie right now. And I'm not going to spoil it, just in case there's someone out there who doesn't know how it ends. This movie just made bank at the box office. Everyone had to go see it. And this was probably the last time that a film effectively kept its secret for so long. 99 was before we were all on the internet all the time. We weren't on social media at that point. Now it's impossible for a movie or a TV show to have a big reveal or a twist ending without it spreading all over the internet and social media immediately. So it was a very magical thing that happened. Now, unfortunately, my friend Brad King spoiled The Sixth Sense for me and my friend Ryan Wantaja before we were able to see it, and that really put a damper on the viewing experience. However, obviously, I could still recognize how effective of a film it was, and it was cool to look around at everyone in the audience and my parents and see how much of a powerful effect it had on all of them. This movie just rocked everyone's socks off when it came out, and this is one of those rare films that's so successful that it's going to launch the filmmaker's career for ever and always. There's a few examples of art making someone invincible as an artist, and this is one of those few examples. It was such a hit that M. Night Shyamalan is always going to be able to get a movie made, because even though it's probably not going to be the next Sixth Sense, what if it is? He's the guy who wrote and directed The Sixth Sense. He could have another mammoth hit like that. And I do think he's made some really great films after that. And he's made some films that audiences have not been as warm and loving to. But no matter how many duds he could potentially make, I still think he's going to be able to have a viable career in Hollywood. Now, he did make a few in a row that audiences were very unforgiving toward, and he eventually had to kind of work his way back up with The Visit, which was kind of like a more low-budget found footage movie. But once that was successful, then he was able to move on to Split, which was very successful, and then complete the East Rail 177 trilogy with Glass. And he's still working in television now and films and producing really good content, I think. But this is what kicked it off for him. This wasn't his first movie, but this was certainly the first hit he had. And this one really just changed the landscape of horror. For the next 6-7 years, it was like, what's the twist ending in the horror movie going to be? Everything had to have a twist ending, and in a way that was almost his own undoing, because he had to keep topping himself with these twists, to the point where I wanted to see a film of his without a twist ending. I thought that would be a twist in and of itself, of just having like just a straight narrative without this big reveal at the end. But obviously, I think studios were really pressuring him to be the twist guy. But I mean, greatest twist of all time, I guess, and this movie it's really a brilliant film. Toni Collette that's where we realized she was going to be the queen of horror. Turns out a terrific performance. She was nominated for an Academy Award. And for a horror film, I mean, it was nominated for Best Picture, Best Screenplay, a few acting performances, Best Director. I mean, it swept up all of these Academy Award nominations, which is almost unheard of for horror films. So yeah, it was just a box office success. That was not the only box office success of 1999. There was also a game-changing horror film that sent ripples of change through the entire industry up until today. I think you can still see this movie's influence all over the place. The fingerprints of the Blair Witch Project are on every wall that you look at. I didn't plan it that way, but that's actually sort of clever because you see these fingerprints and handprints in the film. The Blair Witch Project, it has its detractors. It has people that think, oh, found footage is trash, yada yada yada. This is not the first found footage movie ever made. In fact, there was a found footage movie that came out very shortly before this called The Last Broadcast, which is fine. It didn't make the splash that the Blair Witch Project did, and there was a lot of accusations that the Blair Witch Project plagiarized aspects of The Last Broadcast because they were both sort of found footage movies. I've seen both films multiple times, and I really don't think that's the case, and I don't even see how Blair Witch Project could have seen the film and then got their movie made and then released so shortly after, so it doesn't even really make much sense. Now, the Blair Witch Project, the way they made this film, is pretty groundbreaking. So they have 2 cameras, and the actors are the camera people. They're the camera operators for the movie. So they had to learn to operate these cameras. There's 3 actors that go out in the woods. And the way they directed them, which I think is really brilliant, is they had very minimal contact with actual other crew members. So the directors would show up to their campsites at night and they would fuck with them. They would shake their tents, they would hear weird noises, and they were just told to react to whatever was going on in their environment. So I can imagine it was actually a pretty scary filming experience for them. But each of them would also find little notes for them in the morning. The directors would leave, it's directed by 2 guys, they would leave notes for each of them. And each of them would open their notes and they would have to incorporate those notes into the dialogue for the day. So there wasn't hard and fast script written for them, but they knew the gist of the story and where it was supposed to go. So they had to work their character beats into their scenes for the day. So, the day of, one of them finds out, oh, my character kicked the map into the creek and I have to tell them today. Another character finds out, oh, this little revelation for them. So when they were getting information fresh. So the way they were reacting was pretty natural. And I think all 3 performances are very believable. And a lot of people get frustrated by it because it's a lot of screaming and it's a lot of cursing. But I think if you're lost in the woods and you're hungry and you're really, really scared, I think that's kind of going to be what happens. But most importantly, the Blair Witch Project is fucking terrifying. And if you haven't seen it, it's really hard to put yourself in the shoes of an audience that's watching it in 1999. And a lot of people will tell you, oh, well, it's not scary to you because you know that it didn't happen. We all thought it happened. I didn't think it happened. I knew that it wasn't an actual case when I went to see the movie. I knew it wasn't really found footage. I knew it was an actual film, but it still scared the shit out of me. Easily one of the top 3 most frightening films I've seen in a movie theater. I mean, that thing just worked wonders with nothing. I thought it was a brilliantly constructed film for what they had, and I totally think it deserved all of the recognition and money that it made as one of the most successful independent films ever made. Blair Witch Project kicked off a slew of imitators for years and years. I mean, we're still seeing the kind of ramifications of the Blair Witch Project in the industry today. Now, the 2 directors have split and started making movies of their own, and both of them have stayed in the horror genre. Neither of them have replicated the success of the Blair Witch Project, but that movie's 1 in a million, so I don't know if anyone would be able to replicate the success of something like that. Part of the reason that the movie was so successful was a really brilliant kind of groundbreaking advertising campaign. Well, we mentioned with Sixth Sense, we weren't all super savvy with the internet yet, and social media wasn't a thing, but the Blair Witch Project was the first movie to use the internet as advertising to its advantage. They created a missing website where you could go and find information about these three, aspiring filmmakers that went missing in the woods. And the website was very convincing, and they made like a documentary, like a supplemental feature that was like 45 minutes long, and they aired it on a reputable TV network, and they presented it as like people kind of trying to get to the mystery, almost like a segment of Unsolved Mysteries or something like that. So a lot of people did believe that it was a real thing, and it's really one of the kind of greatest media hoaxes ever perpetrated. I'd say Blair Witch Project goes down in history right along with Orson Welles' radio broadcast of War of the Worlds, because when that came out, everyone thought an actual alien invasion was happening. But it's very rare to get that kind of momentum going behind a movie or a radio broadcast or a TV show or whatever, to kind of trick everyone so effectively. Was a really brilliant advertising campaign. And when you don't have money for your movie, you have to be creative with how you get it out there. And I think Blair Witch Project is one of the most brilliant examples of how to get it out there. So that's movie number 2. Now, those two are the most influential horror films that came out in 1999, and both of them were totally groundbreaking in their own ways. Number 3 wasn't as huge of a hit in America, but it was certainly groundbreaking in its own way as well. Takashi Miike's Audition. Now, if you have seen Audition, it's a very intense film. Now, it's almost quaint with some of the torture that goes on in it, because torture porn came after Audition, so people weren't really braced and desensitized for something like this when it first came out. Now, Audition, if you haven't seen it, it's about a guy who is looking for a wife, and he decides to try to cast who his next girlfriend is going to be, almost like a reality TV show. So he brings in all of these women who think they're going to be part of like a show, and he starts auditioning them, but he has like a checklist of everything he wants in like the perfect mate. And so he's able to kind of go through all of these resumes and pick someone that he wants. And of course, the person he picks is not the person that he should have picked. It has really brilliant filmmaking. Takashi Miike has made so many movies. There's just such a different work ethic in Japan, and you can crack movies out at an astronomical rate over there, apparently, because in 99, I actually think he made 3 movies this year. And actually, just a couple years ago, I walked past a theater poster, and it was advertising his newest film, and they were advertising it as the 100th film of Miike, which is just insane that someone is able to even make that many movies in their lifetime. Like, even your favorite filmmakers that started back in the silent film era, like, they haven't even made 100 films. And I think this is the one that really put him on the map as far as American viewers go. But the movie it still holds up by today's standards. Even if you're kind of inundated with torture porn and violence on movies and television, this one is still really unsettling, even just beyond the kind of torture aspects of it. The filmmaking is really good, and he does kind of very uneasy tricks in the film. He plays with the narrative. So he flashes back in time, he flashes maybe forward in time. You're not sure if these are some of the flashes, if it's imagination of someone or a dream, or if it's kind of an alternate reality that happens. It's still kind of a straightforward narrative that you can easily follow, but there's these kind of strange narrative flourishes that just kind of make the movie a little more uneasy to watch as you're trying to kind of puzzle together what happens. And then, of course, it gets really fucked up and extreme as well. It's not technically part of the J-horror boom, which is a Western term for these films that were coming out of Japan. We're really focused on kind of like a spirit haunting an item or a place, and they were usually centered around technology, like cell phones or the internet or some shit like that. And Audition didn't really have any of those tropes. So it's sort of responsible for ushering in the wave of J-horror in America, but technically it's not part of that wave. I'm actually going to delve way more into detail about J-horror on another night, but Audition was very groundbreaking in that way. This was the first really big Japanese horror film to hit American shores in a really, really long time. One more film. This one is a little more of a straightforward kind of Hollywood film, but I think it is really brilliant. And I think it was one of Tim Burton's last really great visions, and that is Sleepy Hollow. Sleepy Hollow has really amazing practical effects, and it has the best decapitation scenes that you've ever seen in a movie. And I remember when this came out, I was reading about how they were doing these decapitation scenes. Computer generated imagery had been happening for, you know, a number of years, but you weren't seeing it, you know, kind of flooding every film like you see today. So whenever I would hear about CGI being used to kind of clean up a scene or make a little change or something, it always really blew my mind. And what really blew me away about the decapitations in Sleepy Hollow is that, like, most of the bodies are dummies that had heads that exploded off, and they were rigged to shoot off in spin or shoot straight out or fall off to the side. They were all rigged to do something different. And the headless horseman had the hilt of a sword, and there was no blade on it, and then he would just go and pretend to chop the head off, and then the head was cued to just explode off as he sliced, and they just digitally added the sword. So that was the digital element that they added, and the heads sprayed blood. Why I think this movie is really important for 99 is the 90s were a decent decade for horror. There was a lot of good stuff happening, but there was also a lot of very tame horror that was happening. We were moving more toward PG-13 type horror films, and Sleepy Hollow was a hard R because it was gruesome, it was violent, and it wasn't just blood that would shoot out of these decapitated heads. It was the brightest melted red color crayon blood you have seen since George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead. The blood is so amazing in that film, and the movie is like desaturated. They pull out some of the color, so when the red hits, it really pops. I do think that, like, bloodshed in films can be done in a stylistic way that kind of can be attributed to a certain filmmaker. I know on a previous week I talked about how Paul Verhoeven does violence, and it's very specific violence to him as a filmmaker. Tim Burton's brand of violence is as well, and we don't see it that often because he does, you know, movies for younger audiences often, or he always goes for a PG-13 rating. But the times he doesn't, like Sleepy Hollow or Sweeney Todd, when he's able to really shed some blood in a movie, it's a truly miraculous thing. And I do think this was one of his last, like, just fully Tim Burton visions. I think it's a terrific film. I think it is a ton of fun, and this thing is just gorgeous. I think visually it's one of the most astonishing films that Tim Burton has ever made. This is him firing on all cylinders. And then after this, for a number of years, he made quite a few films where you feel like he's phoning it in more, and you think, did you put so much creative vision into some of your early work that in the kind of newer decades you've petered out, or you just don't care as much? I mean, I don't really know. And you know, his films always seem to be pretty successful, and people have varying opinions on them, but I think this is one of the highlights of his career. So those are the 4 films that we're going to watch today. We are going to watch the groundbreaking horror of 1999. And there are other great horror films from 99. There's some really good monster movies like Placid, Deep Blue Sea. Both of those came out. Roman Polanski's The Ninth Gate, I think, has some really creepy stuff going on in it. Idle Hands, Ravenous, really great, about soldiers that are kind of going crazy and eating each other. A lot of great horror, kind of the last stand for good hard R horror before the 2000s ushered in a lot of, you know, PG-13 horror. Was really focused more at all the kids that were going to theaters, but these will all give you some chills, and all of them are so different, scary in completely different ways. Shyamalan's masterpiece, The Sixth Sense, very spooky ghost story. The Blair Witch Project, found footage movie, scariest found footage movie I've ever seen. One of the scariest movies I've ever seen. It scared the shit out of me when I was a kid. Miike's Audition, very fucked up thriller, some spooky stuff going on in that one. And Sleepy Hollow, not scary, but just visually astonishing. Really a great horror film. One of the most atmospheric and gothic films that you'll see. Production design, costumes, and special effects in this one knock it out of the park. And again, that's kind of a last hurrah for hard R-rated horror films for a number of years. So those are four. We're going to watch the game-changing horror of 1999. Hope you guys are taking care of yourself, watching good movies, enjoy this quarantine quadruple feature. Oops, kicked my camera. Thanks for watching. See you next week.